guys, my name is Rachel Tobias,
And my name is Dawn Powell.
and we intern at the Society and Business Lab. Today we'd like to introduce you to Doris Huang, who is the Director of Global Venture and Fellowship at Ashoka, Mexico. I spent last summer at Ashoka and worked in Global Venture and Fellowship, and let me tell you, that's a really hard job and it's a lot of work. But it's also really fun, and you get to meet so many amazing social entrepreneurs who are doing amazing things around the world. And on top of that, people like Doris are innovating on a daily basis, starting new programs, doing all kinds of things like that, which I'm sure she's going to talk about. So growing up in Silicon Valley in the 90s, Doris saw firsthand the economic and social impact of technological innovation on both a local and a global scale. And so her professional experience since then has really focused on identifying and scaling high-impact innovations in the social sector through Ashoka.
After receiving her bachelor's degree in political science from Harvard University and her master's degree in Latin American studies from Oxford University, Doris joined Ashoka's Mexico City office as a Fulbright scholar, where she led the search and selection process for new Ashoka fellows in the region. She subsequently worked for the management consultancy Oliver Wyman in London before returning to Ashoka, Mexico and Central America in September 2009, where she currently oversees the search and selection process, strategic services for Ashoka fellows, and initiatives involving social businesses and social investment. So please join me in welcoming Doris Huang.
Thanks, Rachel and Dawn. Good afternoon, or good morning. I guess it's sort of a weird lunch hour, and I don't really know, frankly, whether you guys are here to hear about Ashoka or to get your free, delicious lunch. Hopefully by the end of the session, I'll have shared with you guys a few reasons why I'm so excited about social entrepreneurship, and that will outweigh the lunch in your eyes. Before I begin, can I just get a show of hands? Who here is at the Marshall School of Business, either as an undergraduate or a MBA student? Okay, and public policy school? Great. Other undergrads in other fields? Okay, and other graduates in other fields? Fantastic. Okay, so we've got a real mix, which is really terrific. As Rachel and Dawn mentioned, my academic training is in political science, which has very little to do with what I'm doing now, and also in Latin American politics and economic history. And I sort of fell into Ashoka by accident. It was largely not of my own doing, but I think it was either Rachel or Dawn, I can't remember who read this card. I received a Fulbright scholarship a few years ago to do an internship in Mexico with a nonprofit or for-profit company. In my particular case, I was interested at the time in what they call philanthrocapitalism, which I'm sure many of you have read about or heard about, which is sort of a buzzword, a buzz term in 2006, when Warren Buffett made his big donation to the Gates Foundation, and Bill Clinton was convening the global initiative, and so it's sort of the hot topic. And I became really interested in this. And based on that, Fulbright said, well, we think you might like Ashoka. And I said, I don't really know what Ashoka is, but I'll give it a go. And it turned out to be really a match made in heaven. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about that. And particularly within social entrepreneurship, my interest lies at the end of the spectrum that has to do more with business-oriented organizations and techniques for tackling social change. You'll see there's really an array within social enterprises of some that are run and managed very much as nonprofits, and then some at the total opposite of the spectrum that are run as for-profit companies that attract private capital and have a strong social mission as well, but are certainly within the business realm. So that tends to be my particular interest. So, in order to introduce Ashoka how many of you have heard of Ashoka or are familiar with it? Terrific. So some of you actually may have seen this institutional video I'm going to put up. It's a 10-minute video. I think it's a fantastic overview of what our model is for supporting social entrepreneurs. And it's also really terrific because it gives 4 profiles of really outstanding Ashoka fellows around the world. So I hope you enjoy it. And after this, I will move into a little more detail about what it is that we do.
Social entrepreneur sees a new opportunity, figures it out, and then they start introducing it at the local level. That upsets the existing arrangements. It underlines the idea that things don't change. It's like plowing the earth.
To identify extraordinary natural leaders who are emerging worldwide, Ashoka has built a rigorous 5-step selection process, a process that in itself helps candidates hone their organizational vision. As Lee Hamilton says, Ashoka invented, refined, and globally implemented a highly rigorous adaptation of business venture capital methods that finds and helps launch the best new social entrepreneurs and their ideas and institutions. 60% of those it selects change national policy within 5 years.
What we're looking for first, and very simply put, is this idea, together with this person, going to change the pattern in their field, education, human rights, whatever, on a roughly continental scale.
Ashoka's real power is that it is a many-faceted community. It enables these ideas and change makers to be together, to do far more together than they could alone. This community without borders is also building business society bridges that will have extraordinary impact. As community grows, change accelerates.
We are fighting against centuries-old problems. Hundreds of thousands of children are used as slave laborers. They were considered and treated worse than animals. I realized that somebody has to take initiative. Somebody has to speak out. Each time I went to rescue children, it was really challenging. It was hard. 2 of my colleagues were shot dead. I was attacked several times. But you have to go and keep on rescuing those children. Each time I bring a child to a mother back home, each time I feel more strong. We have freed tens of thousands of child bonded laborers in the past 20 years. I am very confident that the slavery has to go in my lifetime.
Satyarthi created the Rugmark label that identifies a rug as child labor free. Rugmark's impact on the carpet industry and beyond is global. Now, consumer products from clothing to athletic equipment have similar labels, seen as a marketing advantage.
2 critical things about Ashoka. One is that Ashoka believes that leadership drives social change. And second, that leadership has power through networks.
After the fall of communism in Poland, many people found the free market difficult. They lost their homes, their livelihood, everything. I saw a solution in creating self-help homes, communities in which people help themselves. The state sold us this derelict house for a token sum. We call it Barka, like the Ark, but it carries the unwanted, those left behind. The homeless, alcoholics, mental patients, whole families with nowhere to go. All who come are given work, in the kitchen, driving, building, on the farm. They all feel needed. We gave these people the will to live. Barka has 20 houses, 500 residents, and another 2,000 people come to us for work. My wife and I would like to export the idea of Barka across Europe, so more people can learn to help themselves.
From these beginnings, the Barka model has been adopted by the Polish government and has spread throughout Europe.
Most programs in justice are deficit-oriented. They focus on problems. We focus on strengths. Strengths of families, strengths of government, and strengths of communities in which people live.
A woman came to me for a job, and I turned her away because she had a small child. and that started haunting me. I realized that these women need childcare facility to keep their job. So I started Fulki. Fulki is a Bengali word. It means spark, the spark of a new idea. My two sons gave me their first paycheck, and with that I started First Daycare Center. The best thing about this project is the employer is allowing their workers to come and breastfeed their children 2-3 times in a day. Childcare facilities reduce the absenteeism, they can retain their skilled worker, and migration is also declining. In government sector alone, 1.2 million women are working. Since Fulki started, we are providing childcare facilities to 18 factories. My dream is that all the 2,500 garments factory will have a daycare facility.
Government offices, the banking sector, hospitals, garment manufacturers and other citizen sector organizations are following Huck's model. Nike, Reebok, Levi's and Van Heusen are helping set the standard for overseas manufacturers.
Ashoka has such a broad network, not only of entrepreneurs, but also of people who support this approach to social change, that it offers us a tremendous opportunity in terms of getting the word out and building broader support for fair trade.
In 1993, I had a dream. I saw our poor youth using computers and find solutions for their problems through the computers. People said, Rodrigo, you are crazy, because poor people have the mind of poor people and they never can use the computers. I started an organization called CDI, Committee for Democracy and Information Technology. I created the first school inside a favela in a ghetto in Rio de Janeiro. We have partnerships with companies and international foundations. They give money, computers, and technical skills. We have 106 CDI schools in 17 Brazilian states. Over 50,000 poor youth learn information technology with us. Our goal is to include poor youth in the digital era. We show another way of life. They don't need crime. They find jobs and they change their behavior. CDI is my passion. Every day I realize my dream. I love my work.
Baggio developed partnerships with over 20 organizations, including Microsoft, AOL, IBM, and Unisys. His approach has been copied in 11 countries, changed 1.8 million lives, and it has been recommended by UNESCO as a model for other developing countries. Ashoka measures the entrepreneur's impact 5 years after their launch. Is the work continuing?
We'll rub this video here, so you guys can see. Just go to YouTube if you want to watch the rest of it. If you type in Ashoka University Public, it's the first video that will pop up. And the reason I'm going to cut this short is just because I wanted to the video continues to talk about Ashoka's approach, and I figured it's better to talk about this in person rather than rely on the video as a crutch. So as the video mentioned at the very beginning, the Ashoka model for searching and selecting social entrepreneurs to join our network as what we call Ashoka Fellows is essentially a venture capital model. So the same way that venture capitalists go about doing due diligence, talking to nominator networks, doing site visits, getting to know the entrepreneur, because it's very much about the person and the idea. But if the idea is fantastic and the entrepreneur is a disaster, the idea is probably not going to take off. It's very much about the individual and the force behind the startup. So this is sort of our approach. And we always look for entrepreneurs when they are at a certain inflection point in their life stage. What I mean by this is, we are not interested in supporting people who, many entrepreneurs come to us with a fantastic idea that's on a piece of paper. It's a beautiful PowerPoint presentation, but there's nothing else there. To us, and think about it from an investor's point of view, the risk there is simply too high. You don't know if this person, this idea is going to succeed. So we're not interested in entering that kind of an opportunity. Likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, we're not interested in supporting the Muhammad Yunuses of the world, because quite frankly, Mr. Yunus doesn't need someone like Ashoka to help out with his microfinance model. So we look for entrepreneurs somewhere in between, who are at that point where they've got a model that has demonstrated results in whatever field they're trying to impact, education, public health, human rights, but perhaps needs a bit of a push with networks and with also with funding in order to really reach the scale where they're achieving maximum impact. That's what we're interested in. The criteria we use, again, the video sort of touched upon many of these points. We look for innovative ideas that have the potential for high social impact, even if at the moment that we find the entrepreneur, they may have a small pilot, they may only be in a couple of cities, but we look for the ability for that idea to be applicable in many other contexts. Scalability, as I was saying just a second ago, and systems change. The fellows who you listened to in the video, all of them talked about having a vision of changing, transforming the sector in which they were in. The first fellow talked about eradicating child slavery. He was like, I need to see this go in my lifetime. That's the kind of vision that we look for. Or the woman who has Fulki, the daycare center, she said, my dream is to see this child care facility in all 2,000 factories, garment factories in Bangladesh. That's the kind of systems change we're talking about. And our model is very much about identifying these local change makers and helping them spread their work through a network effect. So Abby told me that the name of that was assigned to my talk today was Investing in Social Ventures Change the World, which I think is actually very appropriate. I'm going to argue yes, social ventures can change the world. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples here of Ashoka fellows I know personally who are tackling some of the most critical and trickiest problems that are facing both governments and the private sector. The first problem is aging, particularly in advanced economies. We all are very aware of the implications that an aging population is going to have on our healthcare system, on our entitlement programs, on things like family structure. And Conchi Bretos is a newly elected Ashoka Fellow based out of Miami, and she served as the state of Florida's Secretary for Aging several years ago. And in that capacity, she came across many low-income communities throughout Florida where a lot of elderly who were living in public housing projects were being evicted from their homes once they reach a certain, I think there's a state or federal law, it might be state law in this case, it says after you reach a certain age, let's say 65 or 70, if you're unable to live independently and take care of yourself, out you go. And they force you into nursing homes, many of which are very low quality. So what Conchi's brilliant idea was we've all seen assisted living facilities. I'm sure there's a lot here in Southern California. We're talking about wealthy residents who are able to pay several $1,000s a month to pay for basically beautiful apartment complexes with recreation centers with minimal medical staffing, so you have a nurse on call 24 hours a day. But again, that's only available to a very select socioeconomic class. So Conchi's idea was, why don't we leverage public funds that are already allocated, so they're on the government books already, but are not being tapped into. Let's use those funds and let's retrofit existing public housing facilities, these are just apartment buildings owned by the government, and turn them into assisted living facilities. And that way the residents can stay in their homes. There's, again, a nurse who's on call 24 hours a day, but the costs are very low compared to putting them into a nursing home. And this way, it also actually creates jobs for local residents, not the elderly, but sort of single working mothers who are in these neighborhoods. They can come in as nursing assistants, for example, and sort of keep an eye on the elderly folks. She's a fantastic woman. Second problem, healthcare. Obviously a big topic in this country at the moment as we're trying to figure out how to move forward with the reform. This example of Ashoka Fellow Rebecca Villalobos, she's Costa Rican. And the issue with healthcare in Costa Rica in this particular case was the lack of access to preventive health services and things as basic as eye care, vision care. The issue here was, well, 2 things. 1, preventive care is expensive in Costa Rica, and 2, many of the facilities, the clinics, are all concentrated in the capital of Costa Rica, which is San Jose. So if you live in a small village in the countryside, you're probably going to drive 2 or 3 hours just to get to San Jose to get your vision checked. Are you really going to do that? Chances are probably not. And so medical problems accumulate until they get to the point where they are just unmanageable. Many of you have probably heard of the Aravind eye care system in India. It's a very similar model. Basically, the secret here to Rebecca's success is creating clinics that attract such high-quality doctors and physicians that wealthy patients would prefer to go there over public hospitals. So wealthy patients obviously have the ability to pay. And the prices that Rebecca charges these wealthy patients, based on their ability to pay, are still lower than what you would pay in another private clinic. So it's obviously a very attractive option for a wealthy patient. Those wealthy patients with their fees subsidize low-income patients who come in and who normally wouldn't even be able to afford these services. Rebecca's been so successful with this chain of clinics called the SBLs that 80% of the Costa Rican population, the national population, has passed through her clinics in the last 20 years. It's a small country, but think of reaching that kind of scale. It's really remarkable. My third example, energy. Big question at the top of everybody's minds right now. How are we going to transition the energy sector worldwide from traditional fuel-based, carbon-based resources to renewable, wind, solar, nuclear? Sergio Sorrens is a Mexican fellow, also recently elected into Ashoka. His concern is not so much with the production of renewable energy, but rather with the communities who live in those areas that are wind resource rich. So for example, if you look at a map of Mexico, it's kind of shaped like a banana. At the bottom of the banana, there's something called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is a very poor, highly indigenous area. They've measured wind levels in the isthmus, and they are off the charts. Just sort of because of the geography, the wind there is incredible. But again, most of the communities that live there are very poor indigenous tribes. So what Sergio is concerned about is someday, let's say British Petroleum or ExxonMobil comes in and they negotiate with the local communities to build a massive wind farm there. Most likely these communities are not going to have the bargaining power that would be necessary to protect the local environment as well as their local livelihoods. So what Sergio has done is he's actually gone out to the United Kingdom where they have a new legal structure called a Community Interest Company, down here at the bottom. It's just like an LLC or like a corporation, but they have something called a CIC in the UK, which it's a for-profit company, but all the profits, a certain percentage of the profits, must be reinvested in community development projects by law. And so what he's doing is he's going to these communities in Mexico that are wind resource rich, and he's organizing them into community interest companies so that they can run their own democratized, as he calls it, renewable energy production operations. And so not only are the local communities running this production themselves, they're also reinvesting the profits from that in their own companies, so in their own communities. So someday, even if BP does approach the communities in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec with this kind of experience, this background, they think about the bargaining power that they will have under those conditions. So again, my argument here is very much that with some of the key issues that we're grappling with as governments and as private sector companies nowadays, social entrepreneurs have some of the most effective solutions. But unfortunately, they can't save the world on their own. From my perspective, working within the sector, I've identified 3 critical needs, infrastructural elements that I think are missing, and that are preventing social enterprises from scaling up to their maximum impact. And as it turns out, many of these needs, I think, can be addressed by people who have some sort of training or experience with business. The first one is financing. The particular issue at hand here is the lack of what I call a defined capital curve. There's a venture capital fund in Mexico called IGNIA, I'm going to mention in a minute, and they are a traditional venture capital firm that invests in the bottom of the pyramid. And one of their co-founders, Alvaro Rodriguez, talks a lot about the capital curve in the private sector. So let's say you're a regular business entrepreneur and you're starting up a company. You know with perfect clarity, depending on the life stage of your startup company, what kind of investor you need to approach. If you think about, let's say you draw, so all of you imagine two sets of axes. On the vertical axis, you have risk. On the horizontal axis, running this way, you've got time. And you can imagine a curve that runs from the top left down to the bottom right. So as the startup company grows and matures, the investor risk is reduced, right? So again, in the private sector, if you are towards the left of this graph, and you're very early stage company, high risk for investors, who do you approach? For startup capital, you approach an angel investor. As your company grows and matures and the angel investors exit, you're going to be looking for venture capital. Then as you move out of that stage of capital, you move into private equity most likely. And then someday if you go public, you're going to enter the commercial capital markets, right? And you're going to look for public shareholders. So that's all very, very well defined. If you're a social entrepreneur and you have a social startup, where do you go? This capital curve is not defined because the actors in space either don't exist yet, or they have a lot of trouble, as I've written here, identifying the measurement tools for social return. So if you're a private investor, you're an angel investor, or venture capitalist, or private equity shop, you know how to measure financial success. All of us know how to do that. It's very clear. if you're a social investor, how do you measure social impact? It's a much more subjective kind of test. So the example I have here is Andres Randazzo. He's a Mexican fellow who's invented a new way of manufacturing cisterns, so water cisterns, highly effective, much quicker than the traditional way of building one cistern at a time, and much needed in rural parts of countries like Mexico. He's sitting on a gold mine with this product and with this manufacturing technique, but he doesn't know where to go get the financing that he needs to scale up his operations. The second challenge is management, and I call this the classic entrepreneur problem because it's something we see with business entrepreneurs as well as social entrepreneurs. Many of these entrepreneurs are terrific, really talented at turning an idea, a creative idea, into reality. That's what they're good at doing, and that's what draws investment to them. However, they're not often the best people to be managing their company or their enterprise once it gets going. And the case I have here is Julia Borgoya, another Mexican fellow based out of Mexico City. She's not a businesswoman. She's trained as a child psychologist. And it was in her capacity in her private clinic when she was seeing child patients that she realized that there's a real problem within child psychology in particular of trust between the doctor and the patient. If your patient is 6 years old and you are a scary psychologist who's 45 years old, wearing a white coat, most likely that child is not going to confide in you, no matter what kind of trauma he or she may be suffering in the home. So what Julia did is she actually invented an interactive tool. It's an animated character. You see the there's various characters now, but this one's called Antennas, this yellow creature. And it's an animated cartoon character that appears on a television screen, and the character is manipulated from behind a screen by the psychologist using keyboard commands. So he has facial expressions, he has hand gestures, he jumps, he runs, and his voice is the voice of the psychologist, but distorted by a voice box. So the psychologist can communicate with the child, and children are so used to cartoon characters that immediately they open up and will say things that they wouldn't normally say to a stranger, to an adult. And so using this tool, Julia has uncovered all sorts of abuses, especially amongst wealthy Mexican families, domestic abuse, violence, and is looking for ways now to bring this tool into the court system so children can testify via Antennas. Fabulous, but she's a psychologist. She's the first person to admit to you that she does not know how to run a social enterprise. Finally, the third challenge is scaling. I'm bringing up again Rebecca Villalobos in this case, who again, as I mentioned, is fantastically successful in Costa Rica. It took her 20 years to achieve the level of impact that she's had in that country, however. Does she want to wait another 20 years to achieve that level of impact in El Salvador or Nicaragua? She wants to do it in 2 or 3 years. But the shift that is required, not only in the entrepreneur's role, Rebecca's not going to be able to be involved in every single clinic in Nicaragua or in Panama, the way she was in Costa Rica, but also there needs to be an organizational shift. What worked for you in terms of scaling up in your organization in Costa Rica may be very different from what will work in Mexico or China or India. And there's a local context that obviously is very important here. And so the organization has to be ready, and the entrepreneur has to be ready to take that leap and evolve the organization in a way that is innovative and appropriate to the level of growth that we're seeing. So that's our wish list within the sector. Who is in this sector right now? For those of you who are interested perhaps in moving into the social enterprise sector after finishing school, I've grouped the main organizations in social enterprise. Of course, there's a social entrepreneur, so you could work directly with a social enterprise. In terms of the organizations that support social entrepreneurs, there are 3 main classifications that I use. The first group is funders. These are incredibly diverse. Their approaches can vary widely. The Ignia is the venture capital firm that I mentioned to you a minute ago when I talked about the capital curve. They're structured as a traditional venture capital fund. They look for 30% returns on their investments. Very aggressive. And again, they make sort of $1 to $5 million investments over 6 to 7 year time horizon. And again, companies that either employ people at the bottom of the pyramid, many of you probably heard of this concept before. The bottom of the pyramid refers to those socioeconomic classes that are usually, farmers, small farmers, or in urban markets, they tend to be day laborers, construction workers. So their portfolio companies must either employ people at the bottom of the pyramid or distribute services and goods to people at the bottom of the pyramid. So obviously that's a very aggressive model. You have something on the, the other, an acumen fund, Agora partnerships, and group capital are all examples of funds. They're also structured as venture funds, but they're much more interested in social return. And so they're looking for either no return on their investment, 0%, or perhaps between 1% and 6% on their loans, in exchange for a really high measurable social impact in their portfolio investments. Then you have something like LGT. This is the investment arm of the Princely House of Liechtenstein. Quite interesting. And they have a totally different approach called venture philanthropy, where instead of using traditional debt or equity models for their investments, they actually are willing to do grants. They're willing to do zero-interest loans, so they really create a package that's appropriate to the social enterprise, so they don't have that pressure to return a certain percent on the initial investment. Second group is technical assistance providers and incubators. These are organizations that are interested in helping social entrepreneurs build capacity. So they provide things like consulting, training, contacts. A few examples here again. Agora actually has an interesting model where they have a nonprofit arm that provides consulting to the investment portfolio companies in the for-profit venture fund. So there's sort of a joint model there. TechnoServe is very well known. It's a very established organization that has operations in several countries. New Ventures, it also has several offices around the world. They work particularly with small green businesses, sustainable businesses. And the last group is networks. Ashoka falls into this particular category. We've got other examples like Endeavor. They work more with larger businesses, whereas Ashoka tends to focus on earlier stage social enterprises that can be nonprofit as well as for-profit. We've got new foundations that joined the fray, like the Skoll Foundation. Jeff Skoll was the first employee at eBay. He's obviously a very wealthy man now and has started his own foundation. Schwab, another foundation that really focuses on more advanced stage social entrepreneurs. And the Aspen Institute, many of you are probably familiar with, they've launched a new network called the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, or ANDE. They're focused particularly on the small and medium enterprise sector, in the sense that it can be a vehicle for economic development. So if you're interested in working for one of these organizations, what would be my tips to you for getting involved? I think the most important thing to emphasize here is that social sector experience is very highly valued within all these organizations. What I mean by that is you can be coming from a business background, but how do you spend your Saturdays? Do you volunteer with a nonprofit in your community? Or when you were an undergraduate, were you involved in student groups that were very active in social service? You don't necessarily have to have worked in an organization that is nonprofit or that is in the social sector, but you have to demonstrate interest in that sector. So if I get a resume that's purely business, and there's no glimmer of social experience, I would probably put that resume to one side, no matter how impressive it is. So that's important. And again, you don't have to have worked full-time for a social enterprise or a nonprofit organization. Volunteering is a great way to demonstrate that that is an interest of yours. The difference I want to highlight here between what I call first-story and second-story organizations is the following. A first-story organization is a social enterprise that is directly involved with the target population. So if you were to go work for Conchi Bretos, the woman who has the assisted living facilities model, and you're to work with her, with public housing agencies, with elderly people on the ground, that would be considered a first-story kind of experience because you're in direct contact with the people you're trying to serve. A second-story organization is all of these guys here. These are organizations that are umbrellas. They provide support to multiple social entrepreneurs in their portfolio. And again, it gives you, you're one level removed, of course, from your target population, but you get a much broader view of social entrepreneurs across various sectors. Obviously, it helps if you've done some work with startups, or again, you have demonstrated interest in enterprises. International experience can be certainly a plus because many of the organizations whose logos were up on the previous slide have operations in multiple countries, even if they're based in the United States. Ashoka is a great example. Our head office is in Arlington, Virginia, but we've got about 15 or 20 country offices around the world, and we serve entrepreneurs in more than 70 countries. So if you can demonstrate, again, that you've had some sort of experience that helps you understand different cultures, which can be a sore point within organizations that are this big, that's obviously to your advantage. And finally, as I was saying, when I identified the wish list of needs in the social enterprise sector, I mentioned that many of those challenges are best tackled by people who have some sort of business expertise or background or training. So do highlight that. I want to go ahead and wrap this up here. There's my contact details. I'm based in the Mexico City office for Ashoka, but I do quite a bit of work with the US program as well, so I'm sort of back and forth. Feel free to shoot me an email. The website's listed here. The first one is our institutional website, and the second one, for those of you who may be interested specifically in Mexico and Central America, which is the region our office is in charge of, just add a .mx on the end, and you'll find our Mexican website in Spanish. So thank you very much for your attention. I'd be glad, we've got about 15 minutes, be very glad to open the floor to any questions you might have. Yes?
Everything that you talked about here is fantastic, incredibly inspiring too, but there's an up-and-coming movement too of young social entrepreneurs that are trying to change the world through their business models as a for-profit entity. What is your view on where this trend is going? In terms of, because that's a whole separate story, of for-profit and for a difference.
Right.
So where does it? I mean, what's your view?
Where's this headed?
Yeah.
It's absolutely a trend, Brent, that you're right. It's very much on the uptake right now, which is an exciting time to get involved because it means people like us who are interested in this can really shape the sector. I think where it's headed is, again, I'm going to cite Alvaro Rodriguez, the co-founder of Ignia Fund. He talks about there's many people in the social enterprise sector who will argue against the use of for-profit vehicles because in the wrong hands, you could see for-profit vehicles being an exploitation, potentially exploitative, right, of local communities, of people you're serving even. His answer to that, which I think is very relevant and very powerful, is that if we look at this from a scale perspective, right, so you could have a tiny nonprofit model that's fantastically effective in South Central LA. But if you want to reach all of LA, if you want to scale up to reach that level, or all of California, or all of the United States, or beyond, you're not going to sustainably be able to do that with a nonprofit model. Most likely, there are always exceptions, but fundraising continuously to scale up to that kind of impact is probably very difficult. Whereas if you are structured as a for-profit, and if for-profit is applicable to your mission, because for there's some, kids with cancer, it's going to be very difficult to create a for-profit business with kids with cancer. But if it's appropriate for your business model, that gives you access to the kind of capital, the kind of private capital that we're talking about here, or philanthropic capital. There's a lot of foundations that are interested in making investments rather than just grants because they want to see a return and that kind of scaling up with the money that they put into these social enterprises. So I think it's not going to go away, this trend of for-profit social enterprise, and I think it's going to be, in my personal opinion, the way that we scale these social enterprises on a national and international level. So it's incredibly exciting. I think the main challenge there is right now building that capital curve. So we have financing that can match those social entrepreneurs who have that vision. Yes?
Can you speak a little bit about when someone is identified as a fellow, what kind of technical assistance or funding or other support, and also how they kind of take that learning back to their organizations, because oftentimes they're one that kind of many staff working towards this idea?
Definitely. So Ashoka is not a grant-making institution. We do provide, in some cases, financial support to our fellows, but the focus is much more on the benefits of being in a network of like-minded people. So again, the Ashoka network nowadays, about 2,500 Ashoka fellows in more than 70 countries, so it's huge. And you can just imagine the kind of knowledge gathering and sharing that can take place in that kind of an environment. Ashoka fellows have been with us 10, 15 years. They always rate that as the most important benefit, not the money that they've received from Ashoka, not even the institutional backing, the reputation. It is the networks. So much of our support, our technical assistance, so to speak, isn't technical assistance in the traditional sense of we go in there and we help them consult on their enterprise. It's very much a much more hands-off approach, and because the Ashoka fellows are entrepreneurs, they will come and knock on our door when there's a need that they're facing. So it's everything from, for example, if Ashoka fellows run into legal problems, we've got a network of pro bono lawyers that we can hook them up with. Or if they want to launch an earned income scheme to help make their model more sustainable, they might come to us and say, I need some business expertise. We've got a worldwide partnership with McKinsey. We can give them pro bono consulting from McKinsey. Or if they're looking for funding, we've got a network of friends of Ashoka who are successful business entrepreneurs who want to give back to social entrepreneurs, and they may be interested in making a private investment in an Ashoka fellow. So you can imagine the multiple effects of the network. And how do we bring that learning back to the organization? Ashoka is unique in the sense that we do really focus on the entrepreneur, not on the organization. We're interested in the organization, but we're primarily interested in the combination of the organization in the hands of the leader, of the entrepreneur. So much of our focus is on the Ashoka Fellow. And some Ashoka Fellows are much better about sharing that knowledge with their teams, and some are not so talented at that. And we don't force it upon them. Again, Ashoka is very much a hands-off kind of model. And the Ashoka Fellows are free to do what they think is best for their organization. Again, because of we spend so much time vetting the entrepreneurs that we know by the end of the process that they are the kind of people who for the good of their organization, will be sharing this kind of information. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit, you've mentioned getting elected or getting selected or these different words, but literally if I'm someone and I think I'd be a good match to be a fellow, how do I get from here to you guys?
Right. So the selection process always begins with a nomination, either a self-nomination, so Abby would shoot me an email or go to our website and there's a link there where you can put in a nomination online. The nominations come to the venture team, we're called the venture team, those who search and select for new Ashoka Fellows. And we always begin with a paper application that's very simple, and using that as a first filter. We decide who looks like the best fit for Ashoka, and we begin an interview process. And it's a very hands-on kind of interview process, and usually it's a series of conversations rather than a single conversation, because there's so much information that needs to get out on the table for us to be able to say, this is a new Ashoka Fellow. So usually it's sort of a few months, several months even, of interviews, back and forth. There's always a site visit that's involved. There's also reference checks that we do. And because none of us is an expert in any one field, I'm not an expert in education, or in human rights, or in energy, or public health, we rely heavily on doing research on that field to understand what is an innovation in the field of energy and what is not an innovation. And we rely on experts in those fields that we've, again, another network of experts and references. And again, the criteria that we look for are the ones I've mentioned before: innovation, social impact, scalability, and systems change. And then once that whole series of interviews and due diligence is completed, there's a selection panel that's chaired by Ashoka Fellows. And they're the ones who ultimately take the vote as to whether a new social entrepreneur should join the network or not. And then finally, the board of directors of Ashoka has to approve every single Ashoka Fellow. So it's a long and arduous process, but that is sort of the core competency of Ashoka, and that's why we're so known for that particular model. Yes?
What percentage of your fellows would you say are candidates for for-profit investment?
Excellent question. Traditionally, if you were to sort of map out Ashoka Fellows based on their year of election, you would see that up until 2000, 2001, 2002, 90% of them would not be investment ready from a for-profit perspective. Because again, traditionally in this sector, much of the work to date has been nonprofit. From the early 2000s onward, we're seeing more and more Ashoka Fellows. I think now, from the Mexico and Central America point of view, we've got about 160 fellows. Maybe 15 of them might be ready for, and even then, I would say there are people who have the potential for-profit investment, but may not be investment ready at that point. So we're talking still a pretty small percentage.
Do you ever pass them on to people like Mia or?
Absolutely. If they're ready, absolutely put them in touch. We think of it as a service to our fellows to put them in touch with these investors. Yes?
How does Ashoka itself fund its operations?
Another excellent question. With all my talk of sustainability and access to private capital, at the end of the day, we've got to shine the light on ourselves. We rely on fundraising. We don't have an endowment. We fundraise every year mostly from other big foundations. Again, Ashoka is not a foundation ourselves. So we approach big foundations, we approach private companies, and high net worth individuals are usually our biggest sources of funding. We do not take government funding based on our policies. Any other questions? Happy to stick around for a bit afterwards if you want to come up and chat. Thank you again for coming, and I hope you guys are inspired to learn more about the sector. Google some of these names that I've mentioned. I can send this PowerPoint presentation to Abby, and she can distribute it to the list of people who RSVP'd. So thank you guys all again, and best of luck.